For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Woodley. Joining me today is Peter Harris, here to discuss his novel, Bare Ground. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and a bit of your background?
Sure. I'm a lawyer by training and profession. I practiced law in the early 1980s with one of the large law firms, and then a couple of us we started a law firm called Cheadle, Thompson & Haysom, which really specialized in human rights law, and we represented a lot of the big resistance organizations, including the ANC, at that time, leading up to the transition. And then I was seconded to head up a region of the National Peace Accord in transitional government structures, and then from there seconded to the Independent Electoral Commission for the '94 election, and thereafter went back to law and also did some international work.
For those who have not yet read the book, what is Bare Ground about?
Yeah, the book is essentially, I mean, it's a novel, so obviously it's fiction, because I get asked that question as to whether any of the characters are based on a particular individual, but it is fiction. You know, my first two books were non-fiction, and I wanted to write a fiction book about where we find ourselves now as a society, and it's really it's a fast-paced novel about political intrigue and corporate greed and corruption and political corruption, or corruption in parts of the public sector and corruption in parts of the private sector, and those narrative threads interlink. It's set in Johannesburg. We all know Johannesburg. It's pretty high octane, it's stress, it's energetic, it's adrenaline fueled, and I wanted that to come through in the book.
Can you tell us about your characters Max Sinclair and Musa Madondo, and what was the inspiration for them?
In terms of the characterization or the characters in the book, and there are a number of characters in the book, Max Sinclair and Musa Madondo are key players in the novel. Neither of them are based on any one individual. I've taken a part of someone here, a part of someone there. I've used my imagination. I've constructed something that never existed before. So they are really, as in the case of so many characters in novels, they are creations from various parts, and, you know, frankly, from my own mind. Although, because we live in an enormously rich and interesting society, culturally and socially, you may recognize one or two characteristics from one or two of them, or, you know, from some of the characters, particularly Max and Musa and Sifiso, but they're not based on any one person.
Tell us the meaning behind the title of the book.
You know, Bare Ground is really a play at various levels, because essentially at one point when there's a discussion between two characters and they're talking about corruption and what it can do to the country, and one of the characters said, you know, at the end of it, if it's with so much corruption, there'll just be bare ground. And it's just really a metaphor for perhaps the ruin that can be visited on a society when that society allows, at various levels, both in the public and private sector, corruption to flourish.
Now, you've said corruption features in your book. Do you think that it speaks to some of the corruption that is happening in our society today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, in writing this novel, even though it's a novel, you know, it is situated in, you know, current day South Africa. It holds up the mirror to what is happening in our society. And let's face it, there's pretty rich material. So while it may not be based on a particular incident because it's fiction, absolutely. Just like a novel that might be based on in the Second World War, for example, would draw on aspects of that conflict, of that great conflict. This aspect draws on components of our current society.
Mining rights and politics features prominently in this book. What was your research for certain aspects of this book?
Well, you know, mining is a very critical part of our economy. And over the last couple of years, there's been quite a lot of exposure to the issue of mining rights, both good and bad, and some of it bad in terms of the corruption and how mining rights have been abused by groupings in the ministry and in the Department of Mineral Resources in relation to the acquisition of mining companies. Johannesburg is a city that's built on gold. It's still, in a sense, a mining town. And I think it's just as ruthless and just as greedy as it was when those people first started digging for gold. And I'm not sure that much has changed. So, you know, mining is central to the development of this country, and it's also central to a lot of its distress and suffering. It's also brought a lot of prosperity to those individuals that were lucky enough to be owners or shareholders in mining companies. But it's a controversial area.
Now, you are a lawyer by profession. What sparked your interest in writing, particularly fiction?
Well, you know, my first book, In a Different Time, was set in the 1980s, and it was about 4 very special members of an ANC sabotage unit that came into the country in 1986. And it dealt with their trial, which was a very big treason trial. And I think it dealt, in many ways, it encapsulated the heroism and the horror of our history, but also the ideals and values which those who made great sacrifices for the liberation of this country, that they embodied. And then my second book, Birth, was about the challenges of the transition in the early 90s, the 1994 democratic election, and the hopes of the nation once that miraculous election had taken place. And this really holds a mirror up to what we've become. And I wanted to do it in fiction form because I also wanted to deal with certain issues or narrative strands that are very personal in terms of how people live. And non-fiction can be quite confining because essentially you're dealing with history, and you can't change a person's character or their conduct. What they've done, they've done.
Did you base any of the deals or goings on in this particular book from things that you have actually come across as a lawyer? Some,
yes, some in part, but you know, this book is fiction, and it's a fast-paced political and corporate thriller, and so what's there is fiction. You know, this has not happened. So when the novel talks about political intrigue of a particular nature, that may not necessarily have happened. Does political intrigue take place in this country and in every country? Absolutely. So to answer your question, it may not, because it's fiction, it may not necessarily have specifically happened because it's a creation of my writing as an author. Are there examples of corporate greed and corruption that exist and have existed? Completely.
And lastly, what are your plans for your next book?
You know, I don't have any plans, to be honest. I just need to think about it. I've been asked to write a book on the making of the Constitution. So that would be, it wouldn't be an academic text, but it would be attempting to bring the Constitution to life and why it's such an important part of our history. And I'll be conducting that research in the next year or so.
That was advocate Peter Harris discussing his novel, Bare Ground.